In its history, Ireland has invaded very few countries. It hasn't really been a feature of Irish history over the centuries. But there is one invasion that occurred around this time that is often neglected, and that is the Irish invasion of Canada. It took place in 1866, and it was as bizarre as it appears. The idea was to kickstart a rebellion in Ireland by distracting the British by invading Canada, by distracting the British and I suppose also inspiring a new wave of protests around the world. The idea was to take advantage of the 160,000 Irish men who had fought on both sides in the recently ended American Civil War. And the idea was to rally these men and move forward into Canada. And the idea was that you would also distract the British because they would be so busy having to defend Canada from this unexpected invasion that Ireland would maybe be undefended, or if you succeeded in capturing Canada, then maybe you could do some kind of deal where you could trade Canada in return for Ireland. So that was the idea. And the plan wasn't even that secret because the newspapers in America at the time advertised it. They used ads in the newspapers to try and inform, to tell people about what was going on, to try and persuade these veterans of the Civil War to come and join them. One song that was sung around the bars in America at this time said, "We are the Fenian Brotherhood, skilled in the arts of war, and we're going to fight for Ireland, the land we adore. Many battles we have won, along with the boys in blue, and we'll go and capture Canada, for we've nothing else to do." They expected to raise 5,000 men. In the end, they got 1,000, and that's still a considerable number, and certainly more than they were getting for the rebellions back in Ireland during this century. And they did march forward and march north from the United States into Canada, cutting up telegraph lines, destroying railway lines as they went along their way. The Canadians were quite confused by all of this. They were treated very well by the rebels. They had no qualms with them. But they were quite confused and saying, "Who are you?" "Well, we're the Irish Republican Brotherhood. We're the Fenians. And this is an Irish Revolutionary Army. And we're coming to capture your country." And the Canadians didn't really know what to make of that. The Americans, though, began to get worried because they were afraid of provoking Britain. They didn't want Britain to blame America for letting all of these people cross the border. And so they called out one of their generals, General George Meade, who was actually the Union commander at the Battle of Gettysburg. They asked Meade to secure the border, to stop any more Fenians crossing over from the United States into Canada. And that had a major impact in blocking any further support, blocking supplies, but blocking any reinforcements as well. The Fenians only had one real encounter with the British soldiers in Canada. They won the battle, as it turns out. The British were forced to flee, even though the British inflicted more casualties. They killed 18 Fenians. The Fenians killed 10 soldiers. But afterwards, running low on ammunition, the British were just reinforced and the Irish were forced to surrender. And that was the end of the Fenian invasion of Canada. That was the end, pretty much, of the Fenian movement in America. Except for some other organisations that set up. And some of these are still a little confusing. For example, there was a group called the Molly Maguires, and they set up in the 1860s and the 1870s. And they were involved in acts of sabotage, industrial sabotage in the coal mines in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And they caught the Americans completely by surprise. The Pinkerton detectives were sent in. The leaders of the Molly Maguires were captured. They were put on trial. And 20 were executed. And again, it's not clear how many of them were guilty or how many of them were just rounded up. And it was still not clear to people, and it's still not clear to people today, what exactly the Molly Maguires were trying to do. Were they rising up on behalf of the workers to kill the capitalist overlords? Were they angry Irish Catholics trying to kill their British rulers or who they sought in America? Was this an attempt to continue some of the Irish campaign in the United States? Were they freedom fighters? Were they vigilantes? Was this connected to Ireland at all? And the story of the Molly Maguires has been often told in cinema with a movie with Sean Connery and Richard Harris in 1970, and in books. But it remains something of an enigma. Something that's not an enigma, and something that poses serious questions to people today, is the role of the dynamiters in the 1880s. Because the invention of dynamite by Alfred Nobel, who would later create the Nobel Prizes, the invention of dynamite by Alfred Nobel in 1866 changed everything for the Irish Crusaders. Because suddenly they had a weapon, an infernal machine as it was called, which they could use to cause devastation. And here you see the beginnings of modern day terrorism. And these infernal machines were constructed in the United States and sent over to Britain to use to strike terror into the hearts of the British citizens. The idea is that a sustained bombing campaign would force the British to give up Ireland, to abandon their claim to Ireland, by planting bombs at railway stations, by planting them in places like the House of Commons, by planting them in public buildings and museums, and so strike terror into the hearts of people. Patrick Ford was a newspaper proprietor, had a Fenian newspaper in the United States, and was a key supporter of the movement. And he wrote about this strategy in his newspaper. He said the ultimate result of this scientific warfare, and that's what it was called, scientific warfare, a new kind of warfare to engage the British enemy. The ultimate result of this scientific warfare will be the ultimate abolition of all modes of warfare. Aerial bombs, Jove's thunderbolts, will yet be invented, with which one man in the clouds may assail 50,000 below. Now, that was actually quite prophetic to write that in 1881 and to predict what would happen in the 20th century. He said, "Ascend in the air in a balloon and throw down showers of such explosives. And what will happen is that the army will speedily be wiped out. With armies and fleets done away with, international wars are done away with." So in other words, he was saying that terror will be used to bring an end to terror. Terror will be used to bring an end to all kinds of warfare. This will mean a new age of peace, an age of peace brought about by bombs. There was a big bombing campaign in 1881 in London, in Liverpool and in Birmingham. And when one bomb didn't detonate in the Mansion House in London, Ford had this to say: "With the tumbling down of these big English cities, down will also tumble England's credit. Down will go her insurance companies. Trade will be paralysed. India and all her other possessions will start to their feet. The lands stolen from the people of England will revert to them again. And with the disappearance of this last relic of feudalism, up will ascend the English Republic." So what actually happened in Britain? Well, what you see is the creation of counter-terrorism units. Specific groups set up to deal with these. You see searches being organised at all the ports in Britain to search people, to go through their packages as they come in, to see, are they carrying dynamite? Are they carrying these explosive devices, these infernal machines? In the same way that we have rigorous airport searches now, you had port searches in the 1880s in Britain. The beginnings of modern counter-terrorism begin in Britain in the 1880s when they had to deal with the threat from the Fenians. And you see these bombing campaigns being used around Europe in this time, around the world. Tsar Alexander II of Russia was killed, was assassinated by a bomb in 1881. And between 1881 and 1885, you see 15 major bombing attempts in Britain, One, as I say, in the House of Commons. In 1883, 70 were injured at Paddington Station. There was an attempt in 1884 to blow up London Bridge. But instead, the 3 IRB men were blown up themselves as their infernal machine exploded in them. And I think this campaign poses real questions to us today in the 21st century, because our experiences of terror with 9/11, with terrorism in Ireland in the late 20th century, with terrorism around the world, has made us feel very uncomfortable about this as a form of warfare. The deliberate targeting of civilians, the idea that you would blow up ordinary people to make your political point. And I think it's very hard for us to look at this and accept it in any way. How different it is from Robert Emmet raising his sword and saying, "Come on, my boys, let's march to Dublin Castle." How different from the example of Theobald Wolfetone. How different from the example of Daniel O'Connell leading a peaceful mass movement to try and win Irish rights. And it showed how the form of combat had changed. That suddenly people were prepared to be more ruthless, to be more aggressive. And it also showed the bitter legacy of the famine. The people who had been dispossessed, who had been forced out of Ireland, that they wanted revenge. They wanted to get back at Britain for what had been done to them. And when they looked at these infernal machines, they saw this as a visitation from God. They saw this as a good revenge for what had happened during the famine. The stories of the ships leaving Ireland laden with food while the people of Ireland starved. And they saw terrorism as a good way of punishing Britain for what it had done to Ireland.